All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ingrid Heckel, and I'm a Conservation and Land Use Specialist with the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program. I'll be giving a brief introduction today. Welcome to the Conservation and Land Use webinar series. Our topic today is local policy to address future climate risks related to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. And specifically, we'll learn about the New York Community Risk and Resiliency Act and guidance for local governments developed under that act, including model local laws to increase resilience. So let me begin with a quick review of some webinar details. You should be able to connect to the audio through your computer or by phone, and you can find the different audio options at the bottom of the screen by clicking Connect Audio. If you're having difficulties through your computer, I recommend calling in, and I put that call-in number into the chat box, and there's also an option for requesting a call back. If you're having technical difficulties, you can reach out to us through the chat, asking all panelists. You can also use the Q&A function to submit questions to our speakers. Note that your phone lines are muted. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll notify you when the recording is available. At the end of the webinar, there will be a brief 3-question survey that pops up, and we appreciate your response and any feedback on our programs. And lastly, for those of you who are seeking municipal training credit, you'll receive an automatic email response confirming your attendance from WebEx at the end of the webinar right around 2:15 p.m., so keep an eye out for that. For those of you who are new to our series, the Hudson River Estuary Program is a unique program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. And we work throughout the 10 counties bordering the tidal Hudson River, shown on the map here, from Upper New York Harbor to the Federal Dam in Troy, to ensure many key benefits, including clean water, community resilience to climate change, the vital estuary ecosystem and its fish, wildlife, and habitats, natural scenery of the river valley, and opportunities for education, access, recreation, and inspiration on the river. And we invite you to view our new State of the Hudson 2020 report to learn more about our progress. Within the Estuary Program, our conservation and land use team works with local governments and other regional conservation partners to incorporate important habitats and natural areas into local land use planning and decision making. And our program website, which is shown here, is a clearinghouse for a number of resources and information on these topics. And I encourage you to check it out. And Nate, my colleague, is providing links to these resources through the chat box. Our next Conservation and Land Use webinar program is a special 3-part series in honor of National Wetlands Month, which is May. And this series will run on Wednesday afternoons starting at 3 p.m. on May 5th and include an introduction to wetland habitats, wildlife, and ecosystem service values, as well as threats to wetlands, understanding wetland maps, remote identification and field verification, and an overview of existing state and federal regulatory protections, as well as local laws and other strategies that can fill the gaps to further protect these critical resources. We'll share the link to the page where you can register for these webinars, and you can and also share it with you in our follow-up correspondence. Also, a reminder that that Hudson River Estuary grant applications are now being accepted for river access, education, and local stewardship planning projects. Grants of up to $50,000 each are available for municipal planning efforts to increase resilience, including climate adaptation and flood resilience planning efforts, natural resource inventories, and open space planning projects, which we recently highlighted in other webinars, and other opportunities as well. And the deadline for that is June 2nd. So our guest speakers today are Mark Lowry, who will introduce the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, and Barbara Kendall, who will provide an overview of the model local laws to increase resilience. And I'll introduce Barbara further before she speaks. Mark Lowry is a 32-year veteran of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and currently is the Assistant Director of DEC's Office of Climate Change, where he's worked since it was established in 2007. His principal areas of responsibility have included leading public outreach efforts for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and State Sea Level Rise Task Force, And he has overseen development of the Climate Smart Communities program and led implementation of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, or CARA, which we'll hear about today. And this work has included drafting a regulation to adopt state sea level rise projections and developing guidance for implementation of CARA. Mark currently leads the state's interagency climate adaptation and resilience working group and is a member of the Climate Action Council's Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mark, and I'm going to pass you the ball now.
How's that?
Looks great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Ingrid, for that long and detailed introduction, and more importantly, for the opportunity to speak today. My task is to essentially set the stage for what Barbara Kendall will talk about a little bit later, which is actually the model local laws that communities can voluntarily adopt to enhance their own resilience. So I'm going to give a pretty quick introduction to the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, what's been required, what the Act actually requires of DEC and other agencies, and what we've accomplished so far. As folks on this call are probably well aware, New York State has suffered flood damage for many, many years. It's nothing new, but the trend in property damage in New York has been increasing over the past several decades as we see more extreme precipitation associated with a warming climate. And of course, we have sea level rise, which is essentially unstoppable for all intents and purposes. We are anticipating that New York State could see up to 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. That is the high end of our current projections. The mid-level projection is on the order of about 3 feet, still enough to cause significant damage. But the thing to be aware of with sea level rise, and the reason I title this Unstoppable, is that scientists tell us that we have already baked into our Earth atmosphere, ocean system, enough excess heat that by the time the system comes to equilibrium, the oceans will rise on a global level by about 6 feet. And so that may happen in a century, it may happen in 2 to 3 or 4 centuries, but eventually the entire world will see something on the order of 6 feet of sea level rise, even if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases today. And of course, we're not going to be able to do that. In response to the increasing risk associated with climate change, and in particular in response, I would say, to the 2011 storms Irene and then Sandy, as well as a number of unnamed flood events, the legislature passed in 2014, and Governor Cuomo signed the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. As many of you are aware, in 2019, the legislature passed and Governor Cuomo assigned still another law known as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The media and most members of the public have, I think, quite appropriately focused on the aspects of the CLCPA that are related to mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, the very aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements embodied in that law, the very aggressive targets to build renewable energy infrastructure. But there were also some important amendments to the Community Risk and Resiliency Act included as part of the CLCPA. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually the CARA, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, as amended by the CLCPA. The original Act did require the DEC develop a regulation, promulgate a regulation that adopted official state sea level rise projections, and we did that in 2017. Those sea level rise projection regulations are due to be updated every 5 years. So next year, near the end of this year and next year, we have to start thinking about undertaking a new rulemaking to adopt projections based on whatever the latest and best science might be available at that time. As we're going to hear a little bit later in more detail, the CARA required that the Department of State, in consultation with DEC, develop model local laws to enhance resilience, to increase the resilience of communities, and DOS released those model laws in 2019. The original law required that applicants for major permits, and when we say major, that actually is a definition that's included in the Uniform Procedures Act for each permit program, required that all applicants for major permits in originally a small set of selected permit programs demonstrate that they had considered future physical risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in their project design. Important amendment by the CLCPA was that the list of permits that is covered by this requirement was expanded to include all permits, what we call the Uniform Procedures Act permits, which is virtually all of the discretionary permit programs DEC has. So that the coverage was extended to almost all DEC permit programs, but also required consideration of climate change writ large. No longer was the requirement that climate change be considered by applicants limited to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding, but in fact, DEC would now have the authority to require consideration of virtually any relevant climatic hazard. There are still some specified funding programs, which I'll show in a moment, where applicants are could be required to demonstrate consideration of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. That particular section was not amended. And then the Community Risk and Resiliency Act also amended a 2010 law known as the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act. The Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act requires that any public infrastructure state agency, including DEC, the Thruway Authority, the Department of Transportation, anyone who builds, undertakes, approves, funds, or supports a public infrastructure project is required to assess that project against a set of what was originally 10 smart growth criteria. CARA added what we call the 11th criterion, consideration of future risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding, to the criteria that have to be considered relevant to when the agencies undertake their Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act assessments. The original CARA did not give DEC any more authority to require mitigation of future physical risk. It simply said that applicants would be required to demonstrate that they considered them. Perhaps the most important, one of the most important aspects of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act from a resilience standpoint is that it specifically gives now DEC authority to require mitigation of significant climate risk to virtually any natural resource, public infrastructure or services, disadvantaged communities, or private property not owned by the applicant itself. As I mentioned, there are a number of funding programs that are still covered by the CARA, in which the applicants can be required to demonstrate consideration of future physical risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. To be honest, the programs where that consideration is most likely to be relevant would be the two revolving funds under which the state provides funding for water infrastructure managed by the Environmental Facilities Corporation and the Department of State's Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. To comply with the legislative mandate, you recall I mentioned that, maybe I didn't mention, I should have mentioned that the law requires DEC to issue guidance for implementation of the law. And the law is not very specific as to what exactly that guidance is supposed to look like or what it's supposed to cover. And so the way we have attempted to comply with that mandate is to develop implementation guidance. And we, the first thing we released was what we call the State Flood Risk Management Guidance, or SFR-MG. This flood risk management guidance is intended to provide non-binding technical guidance to the agencies and program units that are responsible for the programs referenced in the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. It recommends flood risk management guideline elevations for each of a variety of building and infrastructure types. Agencies and units that are responsible for the programs covered by CARA, and remember that's virtually all DEC permit programs now, would then incorporate those recommended guidelines into their own program-specific guidance, and in some cases, operating regulations consistent with the program's authorizing statutes. The recommended guidelines would also be available for voluntary use by state planning, regulatory, or funding programs that are not covered by CARA, and they could also be adopted for local planning, zoning, and floodplain management purposes, although the law does not require municipalities to do so. The draft flood risk, the final flood risk management guidance, which was released along with these other three documents, they were all released on November 4th of 2020. These documents were the result of an intensive interagency effort that involved at least 16 state agencies, and we distributed it to more than 165 local governments for their comments before finalizing the final documents. In addition to the flood risk management guidance document, we released guidance for smart growth public infrastructure assessment, which is primarily focused on giving additional direction to agencies and authorities that must comply with that Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act. We also released at the same time a voluminous document produced under the leadership of Kristen Marcel, who many of you will remember, on using natural measures to reduce the risk of flooding and erosion. This was a specific guidance document that was required by the law. It provides essentially an encyclopedic summary, compendium, if you will, of information on how to use natural resources and nature-based features to reduce risk associated with flooding and erosion. And then finally, there is a document that describes as simply as we can how to use available mapping resources and other information sources to actually calculate and estimate the guideline elevations that are referenced in the flood risk management guidance. And this is being used by permit staff and can be used by others to estimate those elevations, because unfortunately, there still are no maps of these guideline elevations that we reference in the risk management guidance document. I've already mentioned this, got ahead of myself. I'm sorry about that. So again, non-binding technical guidance, but the expectation is that the programs that are responsible for these various permit programs will incorporate this the guidelines that's in this document into their own operating regulations, etc. I'm sorry, I forgot I had all these slides here. So we will make these available so they're available for reference. And I'm going to close, I think, with just trying to dispel some of the misconceptions we've been hearing over the last few years by describing what the Community Risk and Resiliency Act and the Flood Risk Management Guidance and other guidance documents do not do. First of all, they do not require any municipal action. Now, Barbara is going to describe some things that we think would be effective ways for municipalities to incorporate these guideline elevations into their local zoning, et cetera, but they are not required to do so. The law does not come with any funding to either the state or the agencies or to municipalities, but it also does not directly affect flood insurance premiums. Those flood insurance premiums are set by Congress and implemented through FEMA. So nothing we do at the state level is going to affect flood insurance premiums. It does not directly amend the building code, although the governor has directed the Department of State to incorporate, which manages the building code, to incorporate resilience guidelines into the building code. It does not directly establish new permit issuance or design standards for DEC permit programs, but opens the gate, if you will, to allow and provides information to allow those programs, permit programs, to do exactly that. It does not address erosion hazards, although certainly the natural resilience measures guidance is intended to address erosion hazards. The flood risk management guidance does not. And it does not provide a comprehensive flood risk management plan or a climate adaptation plan for New York. It is essentially focused on addressing flood risk, risk associated with standing waters during a flood. In terms of ongoing implementation at this point with DEC, one might think, and it seems to be generally thought, that it's very easy to think about future conditions in a regulatory program. It is not. We are currently working with a number of programs within DEC, including the Division of Environmental Permits, to screen for projects that would potentially pose significant risk if they were subjected to flooding during the application process. We're working on developing flood risk mapping tools to give us a better idea of what future floodplains, both in the tidal and non-tidal environments, might look like, what their horizontal extent and vertical elevations might be. And we are looking to develop more specific, more program-specific guidance that would be applicable for each permit type that DEC issues. And to do that, we are looking at each of these permit and project types, determining what climate or weather hazards are relevant to each of those types, and then further identifying the regulatory and permitting amendments that we would have to make to ensure that the hazards, these hazards are being appropriately considered when DEC issues a permit, and determining what information, maps, and other decision support tools would be needed to allow for that kind of permit review process. Again, it's certainly necessary to provide information not only to the applicants, but to our own staff, to allow that permits can be reviewed in a reasonable amount of time with reasonable amount of effort. So with that, I will close. I believe we can take a few questions, and I'm happy to do that.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was excellent. If anyone has questions, you can put them into the chat box or use the Q&A function. You should be able to access those at the bottom of your screen. And while we're waiting, I had a question. Well, this is one that I've heard before that perhaps others are interested in, which is whether this relates to seeker, whether you could explain how CARA does not relate to seeker.
Yeah, I mean, when the law was originally passed, frankly, there was some people in the business, as it were, say, well, why didn't they just amend seeker instead of building this new law? And certainly the same kind of reviews might be relevant. We have established within DEC a work group. I talked about this ongoing review of guidance for the permit programs. The same group is essentially looking at the question of how we review for how we consider future climatic conditions during seeker reviews as well. So we would anticipate, and in fact, it's sort of a different topic. People may be aware that the Climate Action Council has asked the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel to develop adaptation and resilience recommendations to be included in the scoping plan developed by the CLCPA. And one of the sets of, there are recommendations that relate to how we develop guidance that will be incorporated, amending the seeker workbooks and so forth to describe how future conditions should be considered.
Thank you. So there was another question about how CARA interacts with CEHA. That's the coastal erosion hazard areas, I believe, and local waterfront revitalization plans or programs.
Well, the law specifically calls out both of those programs are covered. The slide I showed with the funding programs shows the LWRP, the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program, as a program where consideration of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding is specifically required. And I actually believe DOS was requiring that of LWRP grantees even before the law was passed, or began doing so pretty quickly thereafter. Barbara would probably be able to answer that question better than I do. The CEHA program is covered. I'm not sure that they have gotten to the point of formalizing adoption of anything from the flood risk management guidances yet.
Thanks. And perhaps Barbara can address that as well. So there was a clarification that does this only affect DEC permits and not municipalities?
That's correct. Municipalities are not, this does not confer any kind of regulatory responsibility on municipalities. So municipalities are only affected when they are permittees. So if the municipality is coming to us, say, for a culvert replacement they need a permit for, then they would be treated as an applicant, but they're not required to adopt any other regulatory requirements.
Great, thank you. Well, I see there's a question about funding that I may pass along to Barbara or have her address after, but in the meantime, I think I'm going to pass the ball over to Barbara, and we can always take some more questions for Mark related to CARA at the end. We'll be leaving extra time for questions after Barbara's next presentation. So thank you very much again, Mark.
Thank you.
For the presentation. And let's see. So while Barbara is getting set up, you should be able to put up your presentation now. I am going to just briefly introduce her. Barbara Kendall is a coastal resources specialist with the New York State Department of State Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure, where she started in 2012. At Department of State, Barbara works with communities on local waterfront revitalization programs, plans, and implementation projects, and the Lake Ontario Resilience and Economic Development Initiative. And prior to DOS, Barbara worked in the environmental management field for 21 years with various state and county and local and nonprofit organizations, including initiatives pertaining to land use, watershed planning, greenway development, stormwater management, and better site design. Thank you so much for joining us today, Barbara, and we're looking forward to your presentation. You need to unmute.
Stop sharing to unmute.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I was unmuted. Okay. All right. I'll try sharing again. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Share again. Okay. Can you still hear me?
Yes, it's taking a moment. There we go. Now we can see your slides.
Okay, good. That's because I'm way out in the rural area of Dover, Dutchess County. Okay, so you can hear me and you can see me. Good. Hi, everyone. I saw a few names from my past on the list. It's great to see everybody on this webinar today. And to add to Ingrid's very nice introduction, I also served 5 years on the Conservation Advisory Council in my town of Dover, and 5 years on the zoning board and 7 years on the planning board. And I just wanted to say that those of you that are involved in those types of boards at the local level, what we do and what I used to do on those boards is very important, making land use decisions every day about our lands and waters in our communities. So just wanted to put a plug in for people serving on those boards. And what I'm going to talk about today is very relevant to what local governments do. So as Mark mentioned, part of CARA was developing a set of model local laws. These models that are in this document, which is over 400 pages, were developed in a partnership with DEC and other agencies as part of a committee that put together this document. They include existing model laws as well as good examples of current local laws from your communities. And you'll see as I talk and go along, there are a number from the Hudson River Valley and Hudson River watershed that were chosen for this document. So that says a lot about your communities. Also, sometimes the staff combined sections from various different laws and put together a model they thought had, parts together made the sum of the parts was better than the individual laws. These can be adapted for local use. They can be plug-in sections to say your zoning law or subdivision law or stormwater law, or you could use the entire model for a topic that your community is not currently addressing. There's 5 chapters in the document. The first one is basic land use tools for resiliency. The second is wetland and watercourse protection measures. The third is coastal shoreline protection measures, which doesn't have, they aren't all relevant to the Hudson River estuary watershed, but some are. There are a few that I'll talk about. 4 is management of floodplain development, and 5 is stormwater control measures. So there's a lot in this document. In the beginning of each of the chapters gives an introduction and overview of that particular topic and definitions, has reference documents, and compares the different approaches that are outlined in the chapter. So there's a lot of good reference material here as well. Oops, sorry. Okay. Then getting down into each specific model local law, they're laid out first with their title, background, and purpose, some more specific information about that subject and some additional references, and compares with other approaches. And then usage, how this particular law should be used. So should it be an amendment to the zoning law and the particular section? Should it amend the standards? Should it amend the definitions? And sometimes it's a whole new law to be adopted. Then it gives the source of that particular law, which if it came from another municipality, or sometimes we drew laws from other states or programs, and then the local law language itself. So that's how each of them is structured within the document. So the first one I wanted to talk about was section 1, the basic land use tools for resiliency. And this includes things like a waterfront overlay district. And the overlay district is something that you'll see mentioned a number of times in almost every chapter, I believe, because that's a tool where the municipality can overlay certain provisions after they map a particular resource, like a stream or a river or wetlands or steep slopes, map it, and then on top of that underlying zoning district can add additional standards. And this is a great way to manage some of our natural resources that we're concerned about. The waterfront overlay district example in the document is adapted from the town of Saugerties. And when I say, I mention adapted every time I'll mention these existing local laws, because what we did is take that local law from, say, the town of Saugerties, and then make it generic, make in brackets, plug in your town, village, or city, or sometimes plug in the number of feet you want to be the setback. Or so we left it so the community could insert those particular specifics in each of the models. So this overlay district purpose is to improve water quality and prevent erosion along the Hudson River shoreline. And it uses 150-foot setback shoreline vegetative buffer strip and steep slope setbacks in that example. The waterfront bluff overlay district it provides comprehensive language. So this second one here, 1.1.3, is an example. It has 8 pages, which is almost an entire law section that you could use. Some of them are short, 1 paragraph. This is an example of one that's a little longer. It provides for adequate setbacks. It's adapted from the town of Lloyd in Ulster County, and it integrates with that community's local waterfront revitalization program. So a question had come up after Mark's presentation about the LWRP program, which is where I work. And once a community adopts an LWRP, they have to implement that with local laws. So a lot of these examples in this document are a great way for an LWRP community, which we have a lot of in the Hudson Valley along the river, to put those resiliency provisions into their implementing their LWRP. So that's one way we encourage communities to do that. Another way, in our grant program, we specifically carved out an amount of money a couple of years ago for updating an LWRP for climate change and resiliency. So we're thinking a lot about that particular topic with the LWRP program. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Barbara. Sorry about that. I'm glad you're back on.
I think I lost power at my house. Of course, you all these things you have contingencies for. You don't have contingency for that.
All right, you have the ball, so you can put your slides back up. And I believe you were talking about setbacks of some sort when you lost power.
Yes. Okay. I'm just getting the presentation. Okay. Okay. I lost power, and then my computer finally came back on then and said it wanted to do updates.
Of course.
Don't you love that? Okay. Okay. I just shared it. Oops. Okay.
There we go.
Is that working? Okay. All right. I apologize. It's really windy here. I don't know if it's windy anywhere else, but it must be what it is. They've also been trimming trees. So either the tree trimmers made a mistake and got the lines to come down, or it's the wind. One or the other. Okay. So I was up to, why don't we start with this is the next slide. Let's go on to this one. Okay. So basic land use tools. In addition to zoning and amendments to zoning, you can amend your subdivision law, and there's lots of different ways that are talked about in the model local laws to do that. Subdivisions in flood-prone areas. There's a model that's adapted from the town of Pendleton, New York. It says land deemed to be uninhabitable by the town shall not be platted for residential occupancy. The next one, safe building envelopes, 1.5.2. I actually have that in my town. Basically says that any subdivision, any lot has to have an area out of the floodplain to build the house, the septic, the driveway on. Drainage improvements. The graphics on the left are in the document and shows, for example, if there's a drainage way, the best way to do drainage is to use what's already there, the way that the water drains. So carve out that drainage area in the back of the lot. So design the lots around the drainage way and the one on the bottom is on the side of the lot. So use the topography and existing drainage in your subdivision law to make sure that drainage happens as much naturally as we can. Design standards to protect natural features. That one is taken from the town of North Salem, New York, and basically says that the subdivision plat should provide for preserving wetlands, watercourses, and water bodies, and have an easement, reservation area, or other control to protect those features. And then subdivision woodlands. I really like this one. It's from the town of Corning, New York, where land clearing standards are in the subdivision law, and there should be no clearing or earth disturbance before the subdivision plat is approved. So they got to leave the woodlands there, do an assessment and a report for the planning board, and then say what they'd like to cut and why they need to cut it. A few more for subdivision open space, and I know a lot of people in Hudson Valley have been doing these types of things for a number of years, including my town. Lot yield calculations so that the regulations can remove vulnerable lands, sensitive lands from development consideration and establish appropriate density. Then cluster open space and conservation development are similar, but go into a little more depth about how to cluster and preserve open space, sometimes allowing more lots than would be normally allowed, but clustering them in an area to protect the sensitive resources. The model is adapted from the City of Saratoga Springs subdivision law. And then another one is disclosing environmental constraints. And this one would be that the town or village or city, or I know for sure towns can require in the subdivision that the subdivision plat show the presence of the flood hazard areas with the base flood elevations, and also require that the deeds include a covenant to notify buyers of the existence of flood hazard areas. So these go beyond what we're normally allowed to require realtors to do, but put that right in the subdivision plat that this is a flood prone area. The model is actually adapted from Montana and Maine for that idea. The town of Skaneateles has a law that kind of combines a number of these ideas together that I was just talking about. So they're in the Finger Lakes, and what they do is, especially for redevelopment and non-conforming lots, you could amend the zoning law or a stormwater management law to allow the planning board to require mitigation of stormwater prior to approving that redevelopment or expansion. And what they do is they have minimum open space that's required, and then maximum impervious surface based on the zoning district and the size of the lot. They also incorporate the idea of overlay districts. So they also have a watershed overlay district where in that district, the maximum impervious surface is 10%. But then they do allow, if they prove that they can't mitigate, they can actually dedicate land or contribute to a fund to mitigate the proposed development or redevelopment. So the Skaneateles kind of incorporates a lot of ideas into one law. Okay, I think I just went backwards. Sorry. There we go. The next section in the model local laws document is wetland protection measures. And I saw at the beginning, Ingrid said you're going to have your own special seminar on this, or webinar on this topic, which is great. But just to highlight what's in the model local laws document, they have some very simple provisions. The 2.1.1 is simple wetland setbacks. This comes from the town of Ulysses, New York. It would simply be an amendment to the zoning law, which says that planning board can increase the setbacks from streams and wetlands by up to 50%. It starts with a 50-foot setback for streams and 100-foot for wetlands, but tells the planning board, gives them the authority to increase that setback if they determine that an increase is necessary. And that's one thing I always found being on the planning board, that we're always wondering, oh, do we have the authority to do that? And a law like this gives them that direct authority. The wetlands buffer is another simple one from the town of Coxsackie on the Hudson River. Requires field delineation, is superimposed over the provisions of the particular zoning district where there are wetlands. The Wetland Conservation Overlay District is from the village of Trumansburg, New York, and that puts a lot of these ideas together into an overlay district. It uses 150 feet, has site plan review required, and certain activities prohibited, and again allows the planning board to increase it. And then sort of the Cadillac of all these is the local freshwater wetland law. The model local laws includes one that came from the town of Pauling, or based on the town of Pauling, Phillipstown, and some Long Island communities kind of combined together. It's 23 pages of a model law. So if your community is interested in that, it has a lot of resources, charts that compare 10 different communities with wetland laws. Then the next section is watercourse protection measures, and similarly has some basic provisions, simple setbacks, which came from, actually I'm not sure which town that came from, but it's a simple setback of a specified width from the center line of a watercourse, which could be added to the zoning law. Stream-related zoning standards. This one, again, is adopted from Coxsackie. Coxsackie has a very comprehensive zoning law with a lot of these ideas, saying that the watercourse buffer has to be delineated, talks about planting, talks about green infrastructure from the stormwater design manual. So a lot of things are combined in that zoning standards one. Then an overlay district, 2.2.3, some of you may be familiar with the Moodna Creek Watershed Council model local law project that they worked on. So this is based on that Moodna Creek Watershed overlay district law, and it gives 4 different options for how the local government can define that overlay district and the buffer area along the watercourse. So that's a great resource in and of itself, the Moodna Creek Watershed Council model local law. And then the last one, again, puts it all together into its own local watercourse law. This, again, is the one from the town of Pauling that is wetlands and watercourses, and requires a permit for various activities. This just shows an example of the type of watercourse setback and buffer that could be drawn out in a local law. So this shows a stream side buffer that would be up to 20 feet, middle section, say 15 feet of actively grown forest, and then the outer section 15 feet, which could be more humanly managed. And the idea is to protect building too close to streams and rivers and protect those environmentally sensitive areas. So that was chapter 2. Then the third chapter in the document is coastal shoreline protection measures. And there are a few in this chapter that relate to the Hudson River, specifically a few outside. Most of them have more to do with the ocean and Great Lakes, but I put these 2 in, shoreline protection outside of coastal erosion hazard areas. So there are no CHAs or coastal erosion hazard areas within the Hudson River estuary and watershed, but some of the provisions that they have in those CHA laws also apply to other areas that are highly erodible. Like there are a number of areas with steep slopes along the Hudson River and other rivers. So this 3.1.3 was adopted from the town of Hamlin, New York, which is on Lake Ontario. It applies to both Lake Ontario and to the tributaries in their community. It's for the whole community, and requires a shoreline development permit for specific actions, and a 100-foot vegetative buffer and 150 feet for septic systems. And this one also coordinates with the local waterfront revitalization program in their community. This law and the consistency review are asked to be coordinated together. And then 3.3.1 is coastal vegetative buffers. This goes back to the town of Coxsackie again, even though they have it in the coastal shoreline. This one says that leave in an undisturbed state this particular buffer that's defined, and no structures except for docks and ramps and walkways. So that's the kind of thing you could do in a coastal vegetative buffer. The coastal shoreline protection measures also in 3.4 goes into a really nice description of the different levels of shoreline management alternatives. So the non-structural measures and natural features, which is siting, also, you know, sand dunes, bluffs, beaches, stream banks, coastal vegetation. Then nature-based measures, which is structural components integrated with living material, and then structural measures, bulkheads, revetments, breakwaters, etc. So it gives a really good description of these and the reasons why you want to start with non-structural and natural, and only use structural absolutely where it's only absolutely required. You know, telling about the natural processes along the shorelines that are really important to preserve. So the ways that these can be incorporated, a simple example is 3.4.1, special use permit alternatives analysis. So this could apply to anywhere where there are wetlands and streams, not just in the coastline, coastal area. So if they apply for a shoreline stabilization measure, if they want to install a shoreline stabilization measure, they have to apply for a special use permit. It won't just get a simple building permit, and it requires them to analyze why they can't do the first two, and they have to do structural and go through a detailed engineering analysis of why they picked the measure that they picked. And this accounts for DEC sea level rise projections is one of the standards for approval in this special use permit alternatives analysis. This 3.4.1 was actually developed by staff, including DEC, and I think some people from the estuary program, and also includes some language from the town of Brookhaven. That's a really good resource. Then that was kind of a quick overview of the coastal section. The next chapter in the document is management of floodplain development. And I've, felt throughout my career that this is really important for us to get a handle on, to stop building in floodplains and figure out how to help our communities do that. The first one is actually adapted from my town, as well as the town of Ankrum, New York, limiting development the 100-year or 500-year floodplain with an overlay district. And in Dover, we added a floodplain overlay district, I think when we updated the zoning law in 1999. And it says no structures for human habitation in that overlay district. We define it as the 100-year floodplain, but it could be also defined as the 500-year floodplain. And you would want to use some of those tools that Mark was talking about for the community to help the community define how you want to define that district in the law. The Floodplain and Wetland Resource Conservation Overlay District, this one was adapted from the town of Greenfield, New York. This use is a little bit more complicated. It uses, the overlay district is based on the 100-year flood zone, the 500-foot conservation buffer zone. So this graphic on the left depicts the second one, 4.2. So that there's certain things that can happen in the 100-year flood zone, other things that can happen in the 500-year conservation buffer zone, includes DEC wetlands. It also considers Army Corps wetlands. So, and it specifies performance standards, including limiting clearing and grading, and it also requires a special use permit. So it just goes a little bit beyond the previous one, the 4.1. Then some sort of basic things that can be done. 4.3.2, establishing design flood elevation. I actually have the next slide. I have a little more information about that, so we'll just skip that for a sec. 4.3.6 is prohibit new critical facilities in flood zones. This seems so simple to me. Why don't we all do it? So it would be amend the flood damage prevention law, the models from the town of Wappinger in Dutchess County, to say that no critical facilities can be in the 100-year flood zone. So this picture on the left is the village of Washingtonville during Hurricane Irene. I mean, how many of you know of a fire station that's in the flood zone? I know of a number off the top of my head, but we don't want to do that anymore. 4.3.8 is required dry land access to principal structures. And this picture I've used a lot. I used to use it in my stormwater presentations, is when I was on the zoning board in Dover, and it was in like 2007 or 8, I think. And we had it wasn't a hurricane. It was just a number of series of spring floods. And this house was built on a lot, but you can see the septic tank wasn't even able to be installed yet because the house was surrounded by floodwaters. So this idea is there must be dry land access to principal structures, and that could be combined with the one that says you have to have a safe building envelope. You know, it's all well good to have a safe building envelope, but if you can't get there, that doesn't do you any good. So a lot of these things can be combined together. So this is just a little more detail on the idea of replacing the base flood elevation that's delineated based on the 100-year floodplain, which is the Uniform Code in New York State requires 2 feet above that base flood elevation. However, we've all found that that doesn't seem to be sufficient. You know, based on erosion, more severe storms, changes in topography, degradation of some levees and flood walls that might have been there for years, and changes in climate. This just isn't working for a lot of communities. So the community can specify a design flood elevation that's higher than the base flood elevation, and again could use some of those tools from DEC to help the engineers delineate what that is. It could be the 500-year flood elevation or a certain amount of extra height added to the BFE, and other deficiencies that you may have noted in your community. So this is a way to get a little bit higher base flood elevation for development. So that was chapter 4, floodplains. And then the last chapter is green infrastructure and stormwater management. And I know we're getting late. There's a number of different things in this chapter. The first set of provisions have to do with steep slopes. That 5.1.2 is performance standards that could be added to the zoning law to beef up requirements for building on steep slopes. The 5.1.3 is an overlay district. Again, taking those ideas, expanding them to delineate an overlay district on steep slopes. The example from Owasco, New York defines 15% or greater of steep slopes. The 5.4.3 is one erosion and sediment control and stream corridor provisions. This one is a law that could be used by a non-MS4 community that's interested in managing stormwater along an important stream or river. And then stormwater utility program, I always mention that because that's a way for a community to build up capacity for managing stormwater with a fee based on impervious surface and development. It comes from Ithaca, New York, is kind of the first community that did it in New York State, I think, or one of the first. And then the last one I want to talk about, or getting near the end, is the models for stormwater management and erosion and sediment control that were developed by DEC. Back in 2006, I actually helped DEC with the first model law. What they've done is update that 2006 stormwater erosion and sediment control law to now have two versions. One is for the basic version, and then it has plug-in provisions for impaired waters and enhanced phosphorus removal watersheds. And then there's a second version specifically for communities that want to increase their resiliency when looking at stormwater management. So a little bit more about that second one. What it does is it takes the basic model, and these could be used either for an MS4 community or a non-MS4 community. But what the second one does in the findings and purpose of the law, it adds references to climate change and resiliency, because that's really important to have those as the basis of that law. It adds definitions for green infrastructure and riparian buffer. And then the stormwater pollution prevention plan adds more provisions for sensitive areas. So slopes greater than 15%, 500-year floodplains, mature forests have to be identified in the SWIP. It's kind of beefing up the SWIP a little bit. And then it includes a provision that explicitly requires the green infrastructure planning process that's delineated in the stormwater design manual. So that goes through a series of steps, and it's not explicitly required in the previous model stormwater law. You know, the engineers have to prove that they won't increase the stormwater runoff after development more than it was before development, but they don't have to use the green infrastructure planning process. This says that through a local law that must be done. And then these schedules in the stormwater design manual that list everything from conservation design to green roofs is included as schedules right in the local law. So that those, you know, the planning board has it right there. The developer's engineer comes in, well, why couldn't you pick this particular stormwater practice for this particular development? That resource is right there for the planning board. And these, I understand, these are going to be posted on the DEC website fairly soon. They've been under development for a while, these two model stormwater laws. All right, so my last slide is not all solutions require local laws. Acquisition of property, where it's really important in the floodplain as an open space. Local home elevation, I didn't talk a lot about that, but there's a number of provisions in the local laws document that do address that. And then something I wanted to mention, that the community rating system, where FEMA allows for credits for the community when they put in place different things like in provisions in their flood damage prevention laws that are more restrictive, things like education, things like MS4 stormwater management, allow them points, and that actually can reduce the premiums of the flood insurance for that community. So a number of the provisions in the model local laws would give points in the community rating system. And then the last one's public education. Okay, we don't have too much time for questions because I apologize about my technical glitch, but this is my contact information for my department, and then also the Division of Local Government Services at Department of State also helped put the model local laws together.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Well, we do have some time for questions, and one of the questions, well, before we go into that, I will just say thank you again to both Barbara Kendall and Mark Lowry for your presentations. I'm glad you were able to rejoin us, Barbara. The recording and slides from these presentations will be shared after the event, and watch for your email for the confirmation of attendance from WebEx around 2:15 today. And Barbara, if you would like to stay on a little bit longer to keep answering questions, we can, I'm available to do that. But I understand if people need to sign off. So there was a question about the issue of legal challenges and whether municipalities have faced legal challenges for restrictions along stream buffers and steep slopes. And I'll just note that living in the town of New Paltz, we have a wetland and watercourse law, which is featured in this document, is pretty comprehensive. And that did face a legal challenge and was upheld. So that is one example I am familiar with. But perhaps you can speak more to that and to how municipalities can avoid legal challenges as they're pursuing new legislation like this.
Yeah, and I will say that this entire document was reviewed by the Department of State Legal Department several times. And that, that was thought about during their review. And another thing that I found is a really useful tool is the No Adverse Impact Floodplain Management documents and tools, and several guidance documents that they put out. And they have some legal briefs where they describe how far you can go. And the Model Local Laws document does as well. About the statutory authority. For example, there's certain provisions for riparian buffers that you need to supersede the zoning law and the way to do that. So there are references to how to put these in place properly. But the topic of the challenge is, I think that Google no adverse impact floodplain management, and there's a lot of information there and that that describes how those challenges can be overcome.
Thanks. There was also a question from earlier on about whether you have any information about the availability of LWRP grants for this year or future rounds of funding.
Well, we're waiting to hear if we're going to have a CFA and if we're going to have LWRP grants. I mean, it's looking pretty good, but we don't know for sure yet. So that's really all I can say.
Thanks. If I'm just checking for any additional questions, and if you have a question that hasn't been answered, you can also re-enter it if it's gotten lost in the chat. One question maybe I'll bring up is whether there's technical assistance available for communities that want to pursue establishment of these types of laws, or how you would advise them for moving forward.
Well, first I advise them to consult their municipal attorney. That's the first one. At my department, in the local waterfront revitalization program in the Office of Planning and Development, we would do it as part of an LBRP development or LBRP grant. But there is the Division of Local Government, which is on the other side of our 10th floor when we're in the 10th floor. And they have people that can give direct technical assistance about local laws. So if anybody needs me to get me in touch with the right person, Chris Eastman is probably the main one, but you could get in touch with me if you needed to find out who that would be. Also, a lot of county planning departments can help with this particular topic.
Thanks. There was a question about why 150 feet as opposed to 100 feet for the tidal wetlands law.
I am not sure I know the answer to that. Yeah, there's a lot of different feet used in a lot of these different laws. Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that. In different communities, a lot of communities, it's actually a political compromise. Sometimes it comes down to that, how much the community can bear in terms of that setback. But I don't know if there's a scientific reason for it, but I could find that out.
And a question, do any of these models provide language that would restrict vegetation removal in sensitive areas?
Yes, and I had a lot of notes that I kind of ran out of time to say because I lost the power. But several of them, yes, restrict clearing and grading. I think there's even, I can't remember which one it was, but there was one of those, the setback ones that said no clearing, unless, like one corridor to the stream of a certain width. So a number of them do. So, one thing I did when I was preparing for this presentation, Ingrid asked me to, talk about green infrastructure. I searched for green infrastructure in this document to see where it was 400 pages. So you could search for clearing and then find out which of those local laws addresses that particular, but I know several of them do. So, and it's on our website. You gave the link, right? Is that correct?
Yes. So we are a little bit past time. The links that we shared through the chat box, we will also include in the follow-up email in a day or two that will have the link to the recording and slides from today's presentations. So I think we're going to stop here. And once again, thank you to Barbara and Mark for your presentations and your time. And we'll also share your contact information if people have other specific questions they'd like to follow up with. But I think we'll stop now, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.